Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Hirschberg. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you to American University's annual Latino Public Affairs Forum, sponsored by the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. This year, we're convening the forum in partnership with AU's Kogod School of Business and its Business in the Capital Center. For nearly a decade now, we've hosted these events each year on a pressing public affairs issue of significance to Latino communities in our region and across the United States. Most recently, our 2020 forum focused on Latino children in the immigration system. That took place just before the pandemic and was, as always before, an in-person event. Today, we're holding the 2021 forum virtually, since we're still not quite at the point where we can welcome you all to our campus. And I gather that we're also not quite at the point where we can get the lighting correctly on your screen. So I apologize for our continued challenges with shadows and the like. We're not quite at the point where we can welcome you to campus, but we're beginning to open up, and we're very much looking forward to holding the event in person next year, and hope that we have occasion to see many of you here at our facilities in the meantime. The annual forum, ALPAF is the acronym that we've become accustomed to using, is emblematic of American University's determination to channel the results of research into the public arena. We want to provide knowledge that can contribute to making our communities better places. The university's new strategic plan talks a lot about change making, and we sincerely believe in that here at the center. It's a pleasure to have all of you join us in this particular expression of that commitment to community impact. As you all know, Latino-owned businesses have experienced enormous hardships as a result of the pandemic, and in many instances, those hardships have forced business owners to close down, to radically revise their business strategies, or to start entirely anew. In some cases, businesses have managed to pull through the moment and position themselves for prosperity moving forward, drawing on their own resources or through assistance from a variety of different public, nonprofit, and private sector partners. Now, we first began to gauge the impact of the crisis on Latino-owned businesses when we partnered with the Greater Washington Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, a longtime partner of the center, in a June 2020 survey of Latino-owned firms in the metropolitan area, in which we tried to gauge how the pandemic was impacting their enterprises. The results were not surprising to us, but they were very concerning to us. And so we immediately pivoted to today's question, which is how and to what degree policy initiatives directed toward mitigating the impact of the pandemic were reaching Latino-owned firms. And in trying to answer that question, we benefited from networks and expertise available to us through Kogod, through the Greater Washington Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and through a number of institutions whose staff and leadership are on the panel and in the audience today. It's been an enormous opportunity for us, a privilege for us, to have been able to work over the course of this past year with individuals playing a leadership role in such important institutions, such valuable institutions. The result of our effort was publication of a report last month. My colleague, Rob Alros, seated adjacent to me, was the lead author, though we both were signed as authors. He really was the principal intellect behind this. And the study is called Pandemic Relief for Latino-Owned Businesses, Lessons from the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. And a link is available in the chat. So if you want to be able to download the full report, you can access the URL in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. In hopes that that study might catalyze ongoing policy innovation and ongoing analysis, we're drawing on it as the point of departure for today's discussion of how well assistance measures manage to reach prospective beneficiaries in the Latino business community. And before introducing our panelists and sketching quickly the structure of our event, I want to say a couple things about the tech interface And also I want to invite my colleague Jim Diniger from the Kogod School of Business to say a brief word on behalf of that school. But first, just regarding some of the Zoom and text specific matters. First of all, I think you all saw that we're recording the event and we will make it available through our website. So if you have colleagues or friends who would like to have occasion to watch the event subsequently, we will get that up soon. We would ask, and I think everyone has done this, to just mute your mics when you're not on screen. And we invite everyone to share comments and questions using the chat. And during the second half of the event, I'm going to try to both facilitate a conversation among our panelists, but also to include questions that arise in the chat, as well as questions that I'll have over the course of the discussion. So please do use the chat, and we'll try to incorporate as many perspectives as we can. So I'd like, as I say, to invite Jim Diniger to say a few words. Jim is director of the Business in the Capital Center at American University's Kogod School of Business. He was, before that, president and CEO of the Greater Washington Board of Trade. Before that, he was COO of the American Institute of Architects. I want to emphasize that Jim has been extraordinarily helpful to me and to Rob as we were trying to design this study. And I think that it's customary for one to say in acknowledgements that any remaining errors are the responsibility of the authors. And we certainly will take this opportunity to say that. But I think Jim really helped us to ask some of the right questions and helped us to figure out how a study like this could be useful to business owners. And I really very much appreciate that. So anyway, Jim, would you like to say anything on behalf of the center at Kogod?
Well, Eric, thank you, and thank Rob for not only the opportunity to partner on this, but for the opportunity to speak today briefly about the Center for Business in the Capital at the Kogod School of Business. You know, it's the first accredited business school in the District of Columbia, but it's not quite as widely known as perhaps we'd like to make it. The business community has grown quite a bit in the past 10, 15 years. And so it is great for Kogod to have a center for business in the capital, because of course we're home to Amazon headquarters too, or to Nestle US or Hilton and Marriott, and so much of the business that is here. But when this pandemic hit, I will tell you that your center stood out among so many different businesses and so many different efforts in the Greater Washington region, and to partner up immediately with the Greater Washington Hispanic Chamber of Commerce and with Nicole Quiroga was just, I think it was the opposite of what I thought happened in the pandemic in terms of the response to the Latino-owned businesses. I would characterize the findings of the study of too little, too late, too confusing, and too disparate across the region. Plenty of opportunity for improvement, but you, Eric and Rob and Nicole, you jumped on a study in June that you did work for as the pandemic was just getting underway. I think that now you're into this second study and there are lessons to be learned so that we don't repeat it next time, when there certainly will be some big element of next time. I'm not criticizing the region. Frankly, I thought that there were some remarkable pockets of success, but we are a region that's balkanized. It's 2 states in the District of Columbia and all of the different counties, and they all do their own thing and still even distribute the federal funds separately and distinct. But when you have a business in the Greater Washington region, you may live in Virginia and work in the district and have kids who go to school in Maryland. Who knows? But it's not one place and one unified approach. And so perhaps in the discussion that goes on with the panels, there could be some thought to using this study as the matrix for what was done, where was it done well, where's some room for improvement, and potentially, maybe it's Nicole, maybe it's others, convenes a summit of the local leadership involved in responding to the Latino need. I'll close with a quote from the study. It says, The diversity of responses across regional jurisdictions and business ecosystems composes a laboratory for evaluating the relative success of policies and programs designed to help Latino-owned businesses. It's exactly what you achieved with this report, that it is an inventory. And I'm not criticizing the work that was done all around the region. It was, I think, a best case effort, a best faith effort, but it was too little, it was too late, it was too confusing, it was too disparate, and potentially for the next time, this report and the collaboration with the Greater Washington Hispanic Chamber could be a catalyst for significant benefit on the part of Latino-owned businesses.
Thank you very much, Jim. I really am grateful for those comments. In fact, what we want to do is to try to catalyze some of those conversations about what worked and what lessons we can derive moving forward. I must say, one of the things that we concluded, and we saw it over the course of our research, and I think it's conveyed in the report, was that yes, responses were disparate, as you say, Jim, and yes, they often weren't adequate to reach some of the potential beneficiaries most in need. But there was a remarkable amount of innovation that went on at multiple levels of government, in nonprofit organizations. And I think one of the things that we hope is that that trajectory of innovation continues moving forward, that we don't take our foot off the accelerator, as it were, now that something approaching a new normal is recovered, that we need to try to keep innovating. We need to try to keep breaking down the sorts of barriers that sometimes make it difficult to work across jurisdictions, and some of which did in fact come down as policymakers tried to respond to this particular extraordinary set of circumstances.
Well, and Eric, I would say that no one jurisdiction did it all well. They all did a very good job in responding, but no one jurisdiction owned this. But each jurisdiction had innovations. Each jurisdiction had one or two or seven things that they did very well. And by knitting them together and collaborating and potentially hosting a summit to share those best practices, we really could gain into the future.
Absolutely, thank you. So let me say something now about the way we'll structure two panels. First, we're going to hear some thoughts from two people who really have played critical roles for the Latino business community in the area. First, from Nicole Quiroga, who has been mentioned. She is the CEO and president of the Greater Washington Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, which is dedicated to promoting and strengthening economic growth and development of the region's Hispanic business community. It's been a privilege for us for a number of years to have worked with Nicole and her colleagues at the Chamber. We have benefited a great deal from those collaborations. We've learned a great deal from the Chamber and its businesses. Quite a number of Chamber affiliated businesses took part in focus groups that we carried out over the course of this study. And so it's a pleasure to have Nicole here to share some of her thinking about these themes. And secondly, also on this panel, Marla Bilanek, who's president and CEO of the National Association for Latino Community Asset Builders, or NALCAB, will be joining us. NALCAB is a national nonprofit dedicated to economic prosperity and opportunity for Latinos, immigrants, and other underserved communities across the US. She previously served as the executive director of the Latino Economic Development Center, LEDC, here in Washington, which features prominently in our study as a critical community development finance institution here in the metropolitan area. Marla had an unanticipated commitment, and therefore we're going to patch in a pre-recorded intervention from her, so that unlike all the rest of the panelists, you can't actually ask questions in the chat because Marla's not here. But she's done some very interesting comments for us. After Nicole and Marla, we will shift to my colleague Rob Albro, who will present what we take to be some of the critical findings of the report. And we'll then convene a panel of 4 experts, both practitioners and analysts. And they will first each offer some initial reflections on the topic, and then I will moderate a discussion among them, trying as best I can to incorporate comments and questions from the chat. Let me say something about who those four panelists are. First, Tara Palacios is Director of BizLaunch, which is Arlington, Virginia's Business and Entrepreneurial Assistance Network. She founded the county small business initiatives back in 2002 in an effort to help entrepreneurs successfully grow and expand their businesses. And over the years, this has supported now 70,000 business owners. Tara and her colleagues, again, were very helpful to us as we tried to gather understanding for this project. And it is a pleasure today, as in the past, to have Tara joining us. Thank you. Rocio Tremino Lopez, she currently serves as the Latino Business Liaison for the Economic Development Corporation of Prince George's County in Maryland. She's originally from El Salvador, but she's also been a member of and headed the town council of Brentwood, Maryland, which is also in Prince George's County. She actually made history in 2015 as the first Latina to be elected mayor in the state of Maryland. So congratulations, Rocio, and thank you very much for joining us today. Soledad Espinosa. Sol has been working with us here at the center over the past year as a research fellow. She's also an adjunct faculty member in our Department of Sociology. She's an economic sociologist by training. She served as senior researcher for the Joint Economic Committee of the US Congress and has more than 20 years of experience working on a range of public policy issues in both the public and nonprofit sector. And finally, Marlene Orozco, also a sociologist. She's lead research analyst at the Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative at Stanford Graduate School of Business. She's editor of the volume Advancing US Latino Entrepreneurship and has published quite a bit in peer-reviewed journals such as Small Business Economics, Social Science Quarterly, Qualitative Sociology, and I could go on. She was justly recognized as among the 40 under 40 top young professionals by Silicon Valley Business Journal. And it's a pleasure for us to be able to include Marlene and her perspective, both from the West Coast and nationally, about these themes that we've been analyzing in the DC metro area, precisely with the idea that it is a laboratory for thinking about the ways in which multiple jurisdictions have handled the challenges of these years. So with that, Nicole, let me pass it along to you. And thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Eric and Rob and Jim, for including us in this conversation. I can't tell you how this experience has been for us and for the Greater Washington Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. I feel like we've gotten a front seat view and not such a great view, frankly, but we were able and blessed with the ability to help businesses one-on-one, and not only that, but to provide information on this very valuable study that I think is going to have a long-term impact for years to come. So just a little bit about me, my background. I've been the president of the chamber for about 5 years now, going on 5 years. Prior to that, I was general manager of Telemundo, WZDC, and Telemundo in Richmond for the better part of 20 years. And I mentioned that to ensure that people understand that my career has been dedicated to assisting Hispanic businesses and the Hispanic community in this region. And I'm very passionate about that. It was really the onset of the pandemic had, as we all know, a very negative impact on specifically Latino frontline workers and the businesses that surround them in the areas that we're talking about in the underserved areas where they were located in these essential industries. And as soon as it hit, we started seeing depletion of savings, less liquidity, layoffs, revenue decline, and eventually, of course, closed doors. The industries that were most affected and what we saw within the chamber, which aligns directly with what the report is stating, is that these industries are retail, construction, hospitality, transportation, and what's classified as other, which could be personal services and whatnot. What's devastating about that is that in these industries, 50% of Hispanic businesses revenue comes from these industries, and 65% of frontline workers work within these industries. So you can imagine what we saw from our end and how many businesses needed assistance during this time, especially in this area. As a chamber, we immediately took everything virtual, and much like everybody else, we're struggling to find first information and second access to capitals for the businesses that we represent. And there, I'll just touch a little bit on the areas where we found it most difficult to be effective as a chamber. The first was, of course, the communications gap that we immediately saw throughout the jurisdiction. And to Jim's point, it's not to offer criticism rather than to identify certain trends in order to fix them and make them more streamlined in the inevitable occurrence of another crisis. So lessons learned within and specific to the Hispanic community. Of course, one thing that became very important was how do we locate underserved communities to allow them to know what is happening. Second of all, how do we do it in a culturally sensitive way, AKA not only just their language, but in a culturally sensitive way to increase the trust level of folks that were not familiar with these types of systems or didn't know where to get any information about what the pandemic was, what it meant, and what to expect. The communication was sent out in different ways, right? Many jurisdictions use press releases and they were on the news and they sent emails. But one of the things, for example, that could be effective and that came out from this report and from our conversations and interviews was that, Hispanics over-index in cell phone use more than any other group. And we may not have a laptop, but we are on our phones, and that's how we really get our information. A lot of Hispanic families are smartphone only, and that's the term that we use. And so, if that would have been clearer, we could have developed a communications plan, a strategy that would reach potentially more of these Latino-owned workers and businesses. The other thing is understanding how much we use Facebook and having that information, albeit some Hispanics don't necessarily trust all the information that's on Facebook, but at the very least, you have another channel to reach and connect with this community because of our usage. And so, not all low-income families have access to broadband, and that would be something that, would make this kind of disorganized information ecosystem a little bit more streamlined and able to connect with everybody. So little things like that, I think the chamber saw, and we're able to report back in reports like this and give data so that it can be used for future communication patterns. Moving on to the financial arena, obviously this is where Hispanic businesses were just taken down. Many people know, but I'll just say it for the emphasis, is before the pandemic, Hispanics were opening their businesses at a rate 3 times faster than any other group. Sadly, we were closing our businesses after the pandemic at a rate faster than any other group. And so we were, and community organizations were tasked to help these organizations find the financial resources that they need. How do you connect these organizations to PPP loans, to federal, state, and local financial assistance? How do you do it? Well, we started business by business and noted another trend. Well, okay, Hispanic businesses upon opening don't necessarily have access to the same capital that other businesses and other groups do. Therefore, they start with a smaller capital amount and aren't able to develop as faster. So in comes the pandemic, and your finances, your savings accounts, your liquidity is a whole different game. And so you're more susceptible to find that you need to either shut your doors or take more dramatic measures. It didn't help us very much, and this is something, again, we can work on, that different jurisdictions, the speed and effectiveness of their COVID assistance and the response differed significantly. And so the message that we were giving our small businesses was pretty much not a little all over the place. And to their credit, information changed every day. And so, we just had to continue, working with our small businesses to give them the access and teach them the information, look at their finances and see where the gaps were. A big gap, of course, was that financial management for many of these micro businesses was not their top priority. And so given that they didn't have the proper documentation to be able to even put in a submission for a grant or other financial aid. And so we had to start with that. A lot of that trend has to do with our lack of trust that comes back through our countries to government institutions, banks. We do keep the money under the mattress, and unfortunately, in some cases, that still exists. So that's another goal that we have, is to continue talking to our small businesses and teaching them how to be financially stable and savvy moving forward. So, what really underlined that was that when we literally got on the phone with many small businesses and made that initial connection to community banks, because there was no relationship to the larger banks. And so because of that initial not having a relationship, only 2.5% of our businesses got any financial assistance from banks or financial institutions. So that just underlines all of what we're saying. What we then saw, of course, was a movement to really connecting with community business organizations, support organizations, CDFIs, and that they were really a pivotal part of our connecting with the underserved communities. These are trusted institutions within our culture, and as we came together with this study, how eager all of these organizations, the business improvement districts, the business-friendly organizations, all were eager to come together and discuss how best they could offer technical assistance and financial access to capital to the businesses in need. So that's how we saw this moving more toward, having our feet on the ground. And I think that's going to be the best way to move forward, is really understand our region, where the pockets are. One of the things that we as a chamber did was actually use our staff to go out and find those places, find those little community blocks where all the micro stores were, the restaurants, and try to connect with the business owners. So it literally takes one step at a time. And so that's something that, we hope to continue moving forward. And so here we are, and I agree with Jim. Now it's a matter of, continuing to educate our leadership in each jurisdiction. I think they'll find this incredibly helpful. And this serves as a beginning plan to, bring the jurisdictions to collaborate together with the community business organizations in a way that hasn't been done before, but seeing results that, will make us stronger as a metro area, which I know has been a conversation for years and years. But yeah, so the complexity, the uncertainness, all of this, gave us success stories. It gave us innovations, as you mentioned, Eric. It gave us a lot of lessons learned. And so we look to be stronger together and to move forward with you in step. So thank you so much for the opportunity, my friends.
Thank you, Nicole, very much. There's one point before moving ahead to Marla Bilanik's presentation. I'm struck by something you raised over these last couple of minutes, Nicole, and it's something we might talk about in the last panel, particularly with Tara and Rocio. But you talked about the community business support institutions that were so important to serve as a link between assistance that might be out there and firms that weren't in a position to qualify or access it and so on, that you needed these trusted institutions. And those institutions, and I would add the chamber to that,
right,
that ecosystem, right? Those institutions were already very busy, under-resourced, understaffed, and then you get hit with the pandemic. And a pandemic in which the demands on them just grow exponentially, and in which how vital they are just becomes overwhelmingly clear. And my question was, remains, and it's something we raise a bit in the report, is whether policymakers are paying sufficient attention to the need to build sustainable capabilities of those community business support institutions for both good times and bad. I mean, do you sense a different environment now than 2 years ago?
100%, yes, Eric. So do I think they're paying sufficient attention? I mean, the short answer would be no, I don't. And for so many reasons, but it's not intentional. I think it's just, time and attention is spent elsewhere where perhaps they feel that that's whatever that is a priority at the moment. I do know that we have a robust list of community organizations that they now, through conversations like this, can identify and then restructure perhaps budgets where there's emergency funding slated to go to these organizations. Now that they've seen the economic impact that healthy Hispanic businesses have had and will continue to have on the economy, this I suspect will become a priority in their budgeting and in their targeting these organizations moving forward.
That's very encouraging. Thank you. So let me ask my colleagues now here in the office if they can put Marla's intervention on the screen.
Good afternoon, and many thanks to the university and to Robert Albro personally for including me and NALCAB in this important Latino Public Affairs Forum focused on pandemic relief for Latino-owned businesses. My name is Marla Bolanek, and I'm the president and CEO of the National Association for Latino Community Asset Builders, or NALCAB for short. We're a membership organization and certified community development financial institution with close to 150 members. Members of our network are working to advance the economic mobility of Latinos across the United States through their work in areas including small business development and lending. Our vision is to dramatically scale the flow of public sector and private sector capital that responsibly meets the asset building needs and opportunities for the communities and families our network serves. As a grant maker and CDFI, NALCAB strengthens and coordinates the capacity of our network to deploy capital. While the Latino community in the United States is often heralded for starting small businesses at rates higher than other ethnic groups, the adverse economic effects of the pandemic have disproportionately impacted Latino business owners. Stanford's Latino Entrepreneurship Institute surveyed 7,000 small business owners and cites that 86% of Latino-owned businesses suffered immediate negative financial impacts from the pandemic. At the same time, Latino business owners were successful at securing Paycheck Protection Program loans at only half the rate of their white counterparts, and only 3% of Latino-owned businesses received their full PPP funding request. It is also important to note that less than 30% of the PPP loans given were loaned to low to moderate income business owners. So clearly, there are limitations of the assistance that's been offered during the pandemic that favor entrepreneurs with more resources and more access to information. Latino-owned businesses have a strong presence in industries that have been hard hit by the pandemic, such as the restaurant industry. Industries that were mostly shielded from the effects of the pandemic, such as finance and information, are led by and/or employ some of the lowest percentages of Latinos. At the outset of the pandemic, Latinos, and specifically Latinas, showed the highest unemployment rates in the nation. In 2019, before the pandemic hit, Latino-owned businesses had hit a record-breaking stride, with their average annual revenue increasing 10% to over $525,000 a year. We are hopeful that this upward trajectory can be harnessed again in the future. This will partly be achieved through the success of programs such as PPP and subsequent PPP loan forgiveness. In terms of NALCAB's response to the pandemic, we provided our CDFI member organizations with close to $12 million to capitalize their PPP lending activities, which resulted in them making 640 PPP loans to small businesses in their communities at an average loan size of just under $19,000. Our membership represents some of the heaviest hitting small business lenders in the nation that really stepped up for small businesses in the pandemic, such as Acción Opportunity Fund in California and Chicanos por la Causa in Arizona, who was the third highest volume PPP lender in the US behind JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America. When the pandemic broke out in 2020, I was leading a Washington, D.C. based CDFI, the Latino Economic Development Center, LEDC. LEDC operates via offices in D.C., Maryland, Virginia, and Mayagüez, Puerto Rico. My overarching observations on the pandemic response of the government in the DMV area is that it was swift and generous. DC government and the Deputy Mayor's Office for Planning and Economic Development, in particular, stepped up with millions of dollars and creative approaches to supporting small businesses, including immediately standing up streeteries and relief grants. Montgomery County, Maryland also was quick to step up with significant resources to provide grants and support to struggling small businesses. Northern Virginia was slower to implement support programs and also came to the table with significantly lower amounts of funding in the early stages of the pandemic. Still, these programs favored small businesses with access to information, resources, and time to navigate the often dense application processes. Those programs that were most effective channeled the community presence, cultural competency, trust, and credibility of community-based organizations to serve as connectors between relief programs and local Latino-owned businesses. At LEDC, in order to connect small business clients to relief funds, we spent significant amounts of time walking clients through the application processes, helping them to round up the necessary documentation to apply, and shepherding their applications through to submission. Without this technical assistance, countless small businesses simply would not have accessed the support they desperately needed and were due. In closing, and looking ahead, there are new and ongoing challenges. In Washington, our downtown has struggled to bring workers back to their offices. I recently heard that downtown Washington is only at 17% office occupancy during the weekdays. This has lasting detrimental effects on the businesses that rely on the business and foot traffic of workers to be working from their offices. Local small businesses are struggling with finding and retaining talent to help produce and deliver their products and services. Plus, there's an overarching technology disparity between wealthier and lower income business owners that impacts everything from delivery of products and services to access to and speed of information. As we position the area for sustainability and growth, we will need to consider how to address these challenges in the long term. I believe in our area's resilience, creativity, and power, and do believe that the best days lie ahead for Latino-owned businesses in the DMV and beyond. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Marla. I think those closing words that you used about creativity and resilience are characteristics that we did have plenty of occasion to witness and that we will indeed need to rely on moving forward. As sketched at the beginning of the program, we'll shift now to my colleague, Robert Albro, who will say a bit about the study that we produced here at the center. Rob is an anthropologist by training, and he's known as our faculty's leading Andeanist, perhaps, but he's also increasingly recognized as one of the region's leading scholars analyzing Latino communities and Latino business in the DC metro area. So Rob.
Thanks, Eric. So already with some of our conversation with Jim and Nicole and Marla's words, what I'm going to be reporting about our recently completed study is going to be circling back to themes that we've begun to touch on. So maybe this will just kind of help to solidify some of those themes. So as was mentioned earlier, June 2020, CLAL's, our center survey and report that we produced here showed some of the clear impacts on Latino businesses in our region, from substantial loss of customers and revenue to liquidity pressures to employee layoffs and closures. And at the same time, we were acutely aware that while that was happening, Latino businesses were benefiting on average relatively less than other businesses from financial assistance. And so that prompted us to undertake the study that we released last month in September, which tries to examine in depth why this was the case and to describe some of the challenges, but also successes encountered by Latino businesses when seeking pandemic aid. So again, with an acknowledgement of the tremendous assistance provided by the Greater Washington Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, we went and talked with the Latino business owners themselves. We talked with leaders and staff of DC nonprofits and community-based organizations supporting Latino businesses. We carried out systematic interviews with stakeholders in jurisdictions across the region responsible for implementing local relief programs. So the resulting study tries to accomplish a few different things. The first thing it does is it simply documents all the federal, state, and local relief programs that we've seen. Now, having said that, I feel compelled to point out that, of course, this is a moving target. And as I was talking with my colleague and good friend Tara Palacios the other day, we were discussing how Arlington County, Virginia has just completed a second round, or just completed the application phase for a second round of small business grants. So, which is not reflected in the report. So I'm sure that's true of other jurisdictions as well. But doing this and drawing on interviews with area stakeholders to describe and identify gaps in relief efforts, but also promising innovations and the most effective strategies for the promotion of assistance among Latino business owners going forward. So our hope, as I think Eric alluded to, is that this study and others we hope are generated that are like it will help to inform approaches taken in subsequent crises and by cities and counties striving to improve support for businesses in historically underserved communities. So now to what we understand to be sort of the report's main takeaways, its main findings. A first thing to underscore is that with their own relief programs, local jurisdictions often quite self-consciously aim to address what they recognized as gaps in federal and state relief efforts by providing typically more targeted aid to specific vulnerable industries or categories of business and micro enterprises, many of whom were initially excluded from or overlooked by state or federal programs. And in the main, as several people have noted, local jurisdictions responded quickly to the economic crisis created by the pandemic. But many small business owners were not necessarily well prepared or even eligible to receive available aid. And some of those reasons are well known and preceded the pandemic, having to do with the lack of a relationship with a bank or the not using a professional accountant and other such factors. These things did contribute to making it harder to deliver aid quickly to many small businesses who needed it desperately. As has already been noted, across the DC metro region, the pandemic emergency clearly demonstrated the value of interjurisdictional consultation, collaboration, and information sharing to identify best practices and the need for institutional structures supporting such collaboration, something we advocate as should continue and grow as we move forward. And as was just explored in the exchange with Nicole and Eric, non-governmental community-based institutions other than banks, CDFIs, chambers of commerce, and other financial support organizations have played an absolutely crucial and pivotal role in channeling information resources, financial and technical assistance to Latino minority enterprises. Breaking this out a little bit further, working closely with local jurisdictions, these organizations were often best positioned to direct needed resources to sometimes hard to reach Latino business owners, including recognizing and overcoming identified barriers to access, demonstrating the value of trust in well-known community-based organizations, and possessing adequate local knowledge of the business community and encompassing ecology, and showing a willingness and an ability to engage Latino business owners where they operate, where they are. Something that Nicole was exploring via social media in some of her comments, including preferred channels of communication. How is it best to talk with these people? In person, where on social media, what traditional channels of traditional media? Importantly, however, the nonprofits working in and directly serving their local business communities, often these were 501c6s, were themselves typically excluded from available financial relief, particularly in the first phases of the response to the pandemic. But that, of course, then limited their ability to maximize the financial and technical assistance they might otherwise have been able to provide during the crisis, again, particularly early on. So what our report boils things down to, and it says, you know, in summary and in anticipation of a recovery, but also the very real possibility of a next crisis, though we might not know specifically what form that will take, we suggest that local jurisdictions should continue to develop nascent structures of interjurisdictional communication and collaboration as a way to better identify mistakes and best practices, and to do so more quickly. Aid should be targeted sooner to specific industries and business types, rather than relying on general categories for identifying such businesses, such as the Small Business Administration's definition of a small business, which doesn't often meet what we might think of as a small business. These categories not necessarily being flexible enough. Local jurisdictions should coordinate at the outset with trusted community ambassadors and well-positioned organizations with strong local knowledge to distribute assistance quickly and efficiently. This work should incorporate awareness of how best and where to engage Latino and minority business owners, both in person and through the right channels of communication, both traditional and social media. And the nonprofit organizations that mediate effectively between relief programs and their intended beneficiaries need to be better supported to more effectively perform their critical function. And those were our key takeaways. And now I guess I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Rob. So I would just remind everyone in the audience that we'll be keeping our eyes on the chat, and feel free to share comments or questions that you may have. And I'll try to incorporate some of those into the conversation that will begin in this, in effect, second half of this event, which is the panel discussion with four guests who I introduced at the very beginning. So I won't go into detail with the introductions, but just remind you that Tara Palacios is the director of BizLaunch, Arlington, Virginia's Business Entrepreneurial Assistance Network. Rocio Tremino Lopez is the Latino Business Liaison for the Economic Development Corporation of Prince George's County, Maryland, as well as Maryland's first Latina mayor of the Council of Brentwood. We'll then include also Soledad Espinosa, research fellow here at AU and adjunct professor here at AU, sociologist with long experience in both the public and nonprofit sector, working on issues relevant to today's discussion. And then also finally, Marlene Orozco at Stanford University, who's the lead research analyst at that institution's Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative in the Stanford Graduate School of Business, where they've done some extremely valuable work looking at the pandemic's impact on Latino business. So I thought what we might do here, just to get started, is that I might ask each of you to take 5 minutes or so to put on the table what you think are the most pressing issues for us to take into account as some of us carry out research on Latino business and access to assistance in both crisis times and not, but also as we engage in policy proposing, policy implementing, as we engage in technical assistance efforts of various sorts. So again, based on your experience, what you think we ought to treat as priorities, concerns that we ought to be thinking about. And I think I'll just go in the order in which I laid out people's names. So first with Tara Palacio, then with Rocio Tremino Lopez, then Soledad Espinosa, and then Marlene Orozco. So Tara, I see you.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I am so very much appreciative of being part of this panel discussion on this very important topic, and one that I believe is on our minds each and every day. I would say, and I think when I spoke to both you, Eric and Rob, when we talked in the spring, when I think back to March 2020, like many of you, I feel scars because I think we felt that, we didn't know how the pandemic was going to play out, whether it was short term, whether it was long term, what were the needs of the community. And speaking from a local government perspective, we didn't know what we didn't know at that time. And our thought was, from our leadership on down, was how do we best help our most at needed businesses, the ones where there were stay-at-home orders that affected their ability to be able to serve their customers. We know that for a long time, and I want to throw this out there because I think this is something that I acknowledged from the very beginning. The US entrepreneurship system as a whole is a house of cards. We allowed the fact that, hey, I've got this great idea, I can start this business, and the next day I've started. But then there are all kinds of pieces and layers and things that you need to do in order to be successful. And sometimes we talk about it, we do technical assistance, we encourage our businesses, hey, make sure you have that structure together, make sure this is right. Oh yes, of course, but I got to get these people hired and I have to do this and I have to do that. And so many times steps are skipped. And that happens to many of us, as businesses are launched and as things happen. And I think what anything the pandemic has shown us and what we've seen as part of this is that as business owners, as entrepreneurs, we've got to make sure that these pieces are in place so that we can quickly pivot and make changes and make decisions as they happen. And so knowing some of this information, we had just 4 months prior to March, we had done a workshop on how to have your business survive any kind of man-made disaster, natural disaster. And it was interesting because people really didn't want to go to that event. It wasn't sexy. It's about, hey, how do I protect my assets if there's a flood? But the information shared was so important and so crucial just 3 to 4 months later. And so during that time, we also started to see things and started to see different things happening. And yes, some jurisdictions were leveraged in different ways where they could pivot. But local government, you've got to also remember, moves kind of slowly. We're trying to help as many people. Government as a whole tries to help as many people as possible. And so to change some of those systems, because there's a lot of checks and balances and making sure that you're collectively helping everyone, that it takes time. So we had to get the buy-in from our jurisdiction to say, hey, look, there's this big tsunami that's happening. We see that our friends and our neighboring jurisdictions are getting grants prepared. We want to do it, but we know with SBA and with federal contracting situations, there's a lot of paperwork. Our folks don't keep paperwork. We help folks that employ 50 or less. Many of them on average are 5. Many are immigrants from all over the world. A ton of them are Latino-owned businesses. So we knew the challenges of being able to quickly pivot, to fill out these federal documentations, and to get a loan from the federal government, working with banks who traditionally have a hard time working with people of color. Let's be very frank. Our access to capital is challenging during good times. you add to it a pandemic and add to it not understanding what's going to happen in the short or long term. There's a lot of skittishness in the market. People that are leveraged, that had accountants that could provide the paperwork that the SBA needed, pivoted and got the money. A lot of the businesses that we worked with did not. And so what could we produce in a very quick atmosphere where things were changing, when we didn't know when we'd go back? I mean, I want to also make sure that I set the tone of where we were back in March. And as we worked through the spring tirelessly, we reached out to organizations like LEDC, like the chambers, and said, hey, what are you hearing? What's going on? We talked to DC. DC was in the midst of putting on their grant program. So to say that it was a good job, I disagree. I know that there were people that were working 24/7 to be able to help businesses, to be able to provide and to retain employees. I think that's where PPP came. It's where you had the shuttered venue, you had different things morph over time as the need changed. One thing that what we did in Arlington was to make sure that we were helping people that weren't getting PPP, that did not receive some of the federal funding that was out there, because we knew that it was a challenge. And so we were very specific on what we did with our grant. We were able to get additional money along the way. A lot of it was from our own. Our IDA also put in money, our bids put in money. Anyone that we talked to at that time was very much open about making sure we help our most, especially our businesses of color. I can't emphasize that enough, because traditionally getting access to capital is a challenge. And so during that same time, we're reaching out. We put on, for the first 3 months of the pandemic, I believe there were 30 workshops that we did live while we're trying to also stand up a grant. And so can you imagine? And in that time frame, we actually, when we were doing those webinars, we hit for that time period about 10,000 participants, because the need, we did it in Spanish. All of our workshops were in Spanish, they were in English. We worked with the SBA, we asked them to do it in Spanish and English. There was an information void that was there, and people were coming to see what they could find, right? And so we worked with doing social media campaigns to be able to promote the businesses. A lot of our businesses, especially where English is not your first language, were getting hoodwinked with delivery services. They were being charged 40% per transaction. And this was the only means of them to be able to, whether it's like a restaurant or a different type of service business, for them to be able to get their products and goods out, because we were all at home, right? And so we worked with those businesses to let people know, hey, call on the phone. You know, don't use these services because the money isn't going back to the businesses. We also did a lot of, y'all, we're on TikTok, we're doing Instagram, we're doing social media, because that's where our clients are. And we have both a campaign in both English and Spanish to reach folks. Another great tip that we learned during this time was we did yard signs. We were out in 100 and some degree weather with our yard signs promoting different types of activities that we had going on. And those were the best. People were calling us. We had dual language signs. We filtered them all across the county as much as possible in areas where we knew that they were hard to reach. And so in the back of our minds this entire time was, we wanted a grant, so that when people applied for it, they could do it on their phone. We initially did it in Amharic, Spanish, and English, and then we decided just to do English and Spanish because that's where most of our businesses, the languages that they speak. And so the second grant that Rob talked about that we just closed last week actually was for our hard to reach community. It was a grant that was specific to folks that had never received any federal funding nor state funding, are real hard to reach people that haven't received anything, thought that the pandemic wouldn't be that long and the effects wouldn't be that long. And so we wanted to create programming and activities and things that could really benefit people coming to them at that time. And I know that it also incorporated not only our Office of Economic Development, our police, our monetary folks, our DMF, our Department of Management and Finance, our Commissioner of Revenue, tax people, Treasury. We would need to make sure that people don't owe money before they get additional money, throwing good money after bad, but making sure that we did all that we could to make sure that if you were eligible and met all of the criteria, that you would get the funding and the cash. And we'll continue to do that. We didn't have big pockets like some of the other jurisdictions. Arlington is only 26 square miles. However, what we did do with the money was decided when we did surveys and we talked to our business community, we asked them, we said, hey, look, if you had a grant, what would you spend that grant on? And we did the surveys in both Spanish and English. And folks came back and said, well, we really need to go into this new normal. I only have a Facebook. I know I need a website. I need help with marketing and branding. And so we designed a program called relaunch.business that actually we started in under 3 months, and we got it through purchasing and procurement because there are things, checks and balances and things that we have to do in order to get some of these programs stood up. It's not on the outside, it might seem like, oh, you just turn the lights on, but it's a whole big thing to stand up a program such as this. And basically, we're working with our friends at Amazon Web Services. They are providing website and e-commerce tools that they will build for people for free. And the county underwrites it. We pay for the monthly fees and the maintenance, and a engineer will actually develop a website or an e-commerce tool for you. And the cool factor on this program, you work with a business counselor who will help you come up with a marketing and branding book, logo, colors, everything you need. And then you take that marketing and branding book to AWS, and then AWS will stand up a website for you in 4 to 6 weeks. The cool factor about that program is it's dual language. We wanted to make sure that whoever providers that we were working with spoke Spanish. And we work with our clients to make sure that they're attending and that they're there. Oh, let me not go on. I can go on forever. But those types of programs are the way that I encourage regionally for people to think about and to coordinate and to really begin with your community in mind to create programming that makes the most sense for you. The last thing I just want to say is that regionally, there is a group called Elevate, which is made up of jurisdictions from across the region. It was a vision of Antonio Das, the former SBA director, district director, came up with this idea. And we've all been meeting from across region for the last 6 months, 7 months. And we've started doing training to providers, nonprofits across the region to make sure that we have access to the best information to help our businesses that need the most assistance. And so there's a lot of exciting things that are going on. And I don't think that we'll ever go back to the way things used to be.
Great. Thank you very much, Tara. There's a lot of very rich insights in what you've just shared with us. Let me just jump ahead and invite Rocio Tremino Lopez to share some thoughts as well.
Good afternoon, and once again, thank you for the invitation to be part of this amazing conversation, because it's a long due per se, especially for the Latino business community. What I do here as the Latino business liaison with the Prince George's County is pretty much do the outreach, the connections to to all the organizations, like many of you here, make the connection, the direct connection, because one of the things that many people need to understand about the Latino community is trust. How much do you trust the people that are trying to get you a product, a loan, a grant? How close relationship you have with people is important when it comes to build that a strategy to make your company or your business grow. So I have faced that for several. One thing is, like, once you stated that you are a county agency, people will be like scared to talk to you. So I developed a different, Prince George's Economic Development allowed me to develop another strategy. So what I did is like go to their business, trying to connect with the people directly in person, trying to understand what the business is about, what they are trying to do, and what is make like an assessment of what the resources they are in need. And of course, that work really changed when the pandemic started into 2020. So when we already establishing this relationship, we have to shut down and try to look for other ways to try to connect with a community that was hard hit by this pandemic, especially in all the industries. The Latinos are mostly high in businesses like restaurants, services, and construction. So getting the connection back and provide that information in Spanish, it is important. I was a part of the translation process too, to make sure the residents and businesses get the information in their own language, because it was so confusing. There was so much information out there. There were different information from different sources. So it could be confusing for somebody that they don't understand and they're just trying to run the business, but they are told that they cannot open the doors because you are, by legislation, you are closed. So that's part of like building that trust with the community, how to connect it with the different resources, different organizations. I work closely with the Greater Washington Hispanic Chamber. I also work closely with the different chambers, just to make sure we provide the information, or bring the information to this community that are striving to survive. So that's part of my role here. And one of the things that many mentioned, the relief funds, we really had a very hard time trying to get our businesses to get the funding, because they're not prepared, because they were not financially prepared to be able to demonstrate their gains and losses, just very basic stuff that they were supposed to have on hand, but they were not prepared. So a lot of people lost opportunity that way, opportunity to obtain funding. So with that, we created this program called Pathway to Grow, which basically we doing 7 type of classes that will help them in the future to be able to obtain funding, because that was part of the big issue we faced, that they didn't qualify because they didn't have the right information or their or documentation in order to apply for grants. So I think that's the challenging part of my job, trying to get the more Latinos, more businesses to obtain the same services and same opportunities as everybody else.
Thank you very much, Rocio. These points that you raise about communication channels with vulnerable firms, often with business owners not fluent in English, often with business owners who may not have documentation, and so on. That question of effective channels of communication is something that really came up repeatedly in our work, and that institutions such as yours really moved strategically to try to fill those gaps, which of course predated the pandemic, but became especially salient during it. Let me just jump ahead directly then to Sol Espinosa. Sol, are you? Yes, I see you there.
Good afternoon. Firstly, thank you, Eric and Rob, for organizing this forum, and congratulations on the recent publication of your extremely important study of Latino-owned businesses in the DMV. As a research fellow at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, I am currently doing research on the economic outcomes of Latinas and mixed status households during the pandemic in the Northern Gateway of Prince George's County and the DMV region. During the pandemic, I had the opportunity to lead research in Congress on the state of Hispanics in America. I also drafted the inaugural report of the Unidos US Latino Wealth Project. This research showed that Hispanics are about twice as likely to face economic hardship, lack health insurance, and face housing insecurity compared to white Americans. Considering income and wealth, Latinas more specifically faced much wider gender gaps than white women from even before the pandemic. During the pandemic, Latina-owned businesses especially took a hard hit. Compared to a national average of nearly a 22% decline in entrepreneurship, Latina entrepreneurship dropped by 30%. The most significant business losses were among Latina non-citizens. From February to April 2020, there was a decline of nearly 40% in entrepreneurship among Latina non-citizens. Part of the ethnic and gender gaps facing Hispanics are because we have a much higher share of immigrants and non-citizens. Still, many native-born Hispanics in mixed status households were hurt more and helped less during the pandemic. Research shows that both citizen and non-citizen Latinos in mixed status households faced higher financial precarity and health risks during the pandemic. Despite a lot of quick response research efforts, there are challenges for us to fully understand the risks and opportunities that Hispanics face. We need better data collection and research dissemination for Latinos. There is a significant gap in knowledge about the full COVID-19 impacts. Early on, COVID-19 data by race and ethnicity were not collected. Only months later did data by ethnicity start to be collected, and it is still inadequate. Yet where research and advocacy are brought together, we've seen more Latino inclusive reforms. At the local level, research shows that deportation defense and immigrant inclusive programs have filled in many of the gaps created by exclusions at the federal level. From research to practice, rigorous research and data have helped to ensure reforms and investments are put in place that are effective and equitable. Also, evaluation is key to building continued support for the bold ideas being proposed and implemented locally so that we can scale up and extend the needed programs and policies throughout the US. Many of the reforms will involve universal policies for all, such as raising the minimum wage, building out care infrastructure, small business assistance, and distributing not just income, but also wealth more equitably. But some of the policies are immigrant or Latino specific, such as protecting undocumented immigrants and Latino-owned businesses from predatory lending, unfair rental agreements, and inadequate spaces for businesses and working families to thrive. My research now is starting to look at how variation in local policy and the shock of the pandemic may drive different economic outcomes and recovery time horizons in the DMV area. In the discussion, I look forward to having a robust conversations about other lessons learned from the pandemic. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. So I'm reminded, you mentioned at the very outset of your remarks, the project that you coordinated with Unidos US. Am I right that the title was the Latino Wealth Project? Oh, oops, we lost. There you go. It's the Latino Wealth Project. Is that what it's called?
And building a more equitable coronavirus response.
Okay, I'm going to see if my staff who's doing the platform here, if they can put a link to that in the chat, or if you have a link handy.
Yeah, I can share a link.
Okay, yeah, go ahead and put a link in the chat. And I really recommend the study. It's a product of research by Sol, but in partnership with scholars from a number of different institutions. And it was really both very well done and very significant findings. So I encourage people to take a look at that. Let me jump ahead to Marlene Orozco.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much, and good afternoon here from us in California. So my name is Marlene Orozco, and I lead the research initiative at the Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative. We've been gathering data on Latino-owned businesses since 2015 to better understand both the opportunities and the challenges that Latino business owners face. They are, as you've heard today, the fastest growing segment of the business population. And last year, as part of our annual survey efforts, we surveyed 7,000 business owners, half of whom self-identified as Latino and the other half as non-Latino white, to serve as a benchmark comparison group. We also conducted a number of pulse surveys throughout the pandemic on the same group of entrepreneurs to see their impact over time. And before describing some of the challenges that surfaced from that research, which in many ways echoes what has already been shared today, I'd like to start by framing the opportunity. According to the latest census, the 2020 population census, Latinos now make up 19% of the total US population, which represents 62.1 million people. And this has grown 23% since 2010. And in addition to representing a formidable consumer base, with the Latino consumption totaling $1.85 trillion, as has been noted, Latinos are starting businesses at a faster rate than all other demographic groups, 44% in the last 10 years compared to just 1% for non-Latinos. So what this means is that these growing consumption and population patterns and business ownership trends result in $2.75 trillion of total economic output for Latinos in the United States. If we were to codify Latinos in the US as a nation, they would be the 7th largest GDP in the world, beating that of France. So, oftentimes, there are very valid moral and social arguments to be made about supporting the Latino community across health, across education, and increasingly so across business ownership. But at SLAE, we also want to advance and elevate the economic argument. There's a very real economic impact here, as all trends point towards continual growth. And at SLAE, we also believe that the experiences of Latinos are critical for reshaping and rebuilding the US economy post-pandemic. If we were to take the last recession, the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, there actually would have been fewer businesses in 2012 compared to 2007 were it not for Latinos starting businesses. So with some of our work in this past year, we've uncovered some themes, and I want to lay them out here. And I think that they, again, resonate very much so with what's already been talked about. So I want to continue here with the first theme of growth. So last year, we reported on the fact that Latinos are not just starting businesses at a faster rate, they're also starting businesses at a faster rate across virtually all industries. Latinos certainly do over-index in other services and food and food and accommodations industry, which have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. But Latinos also saw important growth in construction, growing 32% between 2012 and 2017. And this was followed by growth in the finance and insurance sector, which grew 27% over that same time period. Transportation and warehousing has grown 25% for Latinos over that same time period. So it has real estate and administrative support and waste management growing 22%. So it's important to keep all of these industry makeups in mind, as those really kind of impact how we think about policies moving forward. I also want to note that part of our research focuses on Latino employer businesses as job creators and those that are poised to contribute to the economy beyond kind of a personal wealth generation. And Latino employer businesses are growing their revenues at a faster rate than white-owned employer businesses. And we do see a stalling out of this revenue growth. Part of this can be attributed to a lack of access to capital, which we often talk about as a persistent barrier. Latino-owned businesses are also younger on average, and so we might be seeing this stalling out as it relates to some of these persistent challenges. And let's see, I want to talk now a little bit about the next theme, which is around this segmentation. We talked a little bit about the importance of segmenting across industry. I think oftentimes Latino business owners can be depicted as necessity driven. They are unemployed or low skilled and are choosing entrepreneurship as a matter of survival. And this may in fact be the case for many, certainly for undocumented individuals who go into entrepreneurship as a matter of survival and lack of opportunity elsewhere. But self-employed Latinos are also more highly educated than the general Latino public. They're more likely to be homeowners. So again, it's important to think about how we segment policies around the needs of businesses across industry and across industry size. So segmentation matters. There's important regional differences to consider, and the survey that was conducted specifically for the Washington, D.C. metro area is so critical in this regard. Our research often positions kind of a benchmark. What are some of the national trends? And our goal is to continue to augment our sample size so we can drill down deep on some of these experiences at a regional level in a more nuanced way. So I'm encouraged by the work that the infrastructure that's already been driven here with these efforts. As has already been noted by Dr. Espinosa, Latinas were the hardest hit segment. They were twice as likely to close compared to their male counterparts, and significantly more relative to their white counterparts. They were more likely to miss scheduled rent payments. So again, segmentation is key. We've also heard today at this forum about institutions and capital. So types of lending institutions have been critical. Certainly with the experiences of the Paycheck Protection Program. There has been some research studies that show disparate outcomes by lending institutions. There's also been prior work on audit studies, for instance, showing that at the point of initial loan engagement, Black business owners, which we can extend to in some ways to the experiences of Latino business owners, they're shown different and more expensive business products, or they're questioned about the legitimacy of their business, asked for proof of registration, et cetera. So that's at the beginning of the pipeline of soliciting financing. And then if we look at the outcomes, there's also disparate outcomes. This past year, we conducted an analysis where we looked at what the outcomes were for national bank loans, which are a traditional source of capital. And if you look at, if you compare Latino business owners and white business owners, and you hold constant business performance measures like revenue size, industry profitability, and even the credit scores, the personal credit scores of the business owner, if you're Latino, your odds of loan approval from a national bank are 60% lower. And so type of lending institutions matter. We saw the work of, and this has been again echoed already. I feel, I'm at the tail end here, so a lot of things have already been said, but community development financial institutions played a critical role. Chicanos por la Causa had, top 5 volume. They're a Latino-led CDFI in Arizona. Capital Plus Financial, they are a Latino-led CDFI out of Texas. Together, these two organizations deployed $14 billion in capital to largely Latino-owned businesses and others. So there's a real market need. There's a real need for capital, certainly exacerbated by the, those who are seeking to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic. And the last thing that I'll cover that again echoes what others have said are the role of networks and trusted organizations. In our latest report, we had uncovered that for Latino business owners that participate in formal business organizations, whether they be chambers of commerce, trade associations, et cetera, they're more likely to experience funding success. They're more likely to come into contact with capital providers. We saw these organizations step up with producing webinars. You heard a couple of those examples here today. And, leveraging some of these cultural nuances, the fact that this has also been shared today, that Latinos over-index on mobile phone usage and social media usage. So, to the extent that these organizations can provide technical assistance on how to deploy and mobilize what Latinos are already doing for personal use for a business purpose, for marketing, et cetera. I think that that's where some of the organizations are really stepping up, in addition to connecting these entrepreneurs to capital and other financial resources. So what's next for us at SLAY before we open up for a conversation and questions? We're currently in the thick of data analysis of our largest survey to date, 15,000 business owners. So what we're doing with that, we're continuing to uncover the impacts of the Paycheck Protection Program, which deployed over $800 billion over 3 rounds. There were some important rule changes that happened. February 24th of this year, for instance, the SBA ran a 14-day exclusivity period where they were just deploying PPP funding to the smallest of the small businesses and minority businesses, those that were business owners that were formerly incarcerated, et cetera. So we want to capture some of the impact that may have had. Some teasers for that report as well are the strategic business changes that Latino business owners deployed, oftentimes classified as business pivots. There was a fast rate of technology adoption as a matter of survival. We saw, restaurants using Zoom as well in creative ways, right? So there's an Argentinian pupusa restaurant in Denver. Prior to the pandemic, their fastest growing revenue line was coming through empanada making classes. And so they thought they were going to have to close down that revenue stream. But in fact, they were able to successfully pivot and do those classes online. They would prepackage all of the materials for folks to pick up in site at the restaurant, go back and together make pupusas and build a sense of community with others. So we're unpacking some of those stories and also quantifying what those strategies were. And then one final note is on this notion of resiliency related to those pivots, an overwhelming sense of optimism despite some of the challenges that were uncovered. At the height of the pandemic last summer and through the winter, Latinos were exhibiting equal rates of optimism compared to their white counterparts. 80% last summer, 67% in September of last year. That had slightly waned with the ongoing impact on ongoing existence of the pandemic. But it's important to note kind of how these can carry the business owners forward. So with that, I'll pause, and I'm looking forward to continuing to engage in discussion.
Thank you very much, Marlene. And let me again just invite people, feel free to put comments or questions in the chat. But let me just get started here and draw on something that you pointed out, Marlene, and it really came up in several of these interventions. And I guess what I'm wondering if you can comment on is the idea of, are things now going to be different moving forward in critical dimensions like, and let me mention two of them that came up. One is the question of organizations. So you just pointed out, Marlene, and it's something that both Tara and Rocio raised as well, that the most vulnerable small business owners, often in informal sector and so on, they didn't have organizations to which they knew they could go to get information, to access technical assistance and so on and so forth. And this obviously being a critical barrier for the most vulnerable of firms. And I'm wondering whether this experience over the past year and a half may be catalyzing a qualitative shift in the degree to which those vulnerable businesses may be engaged with organization moving forward. And similarly on the capital front, Tara said it at the very beginning, and it was clear in a lot of work we've done here over the years that accessing capital has been more difficult for business owners of color, even well before the pandemic. And certainly the pandemic then reinforced those inequalities, those inequities. And I'm wondering whether all of the innovation that took place with the CDFIs that you were just mentioning, Marlene, and I'm wondering whether the financial landscape is actually going to be looking different moving forward in a kind of enduring way. So do we see some positive signs along these lines, or is it much too early to be feeling particularly optimistic about change? I was more long-winded on that than I intended to be, but I'm really motivated by what you all brought to the table.
Sure, I can start. I can kick us off here. So I do think that there is in motion some change. So we talked about community development financial institutions, CDFIs. There's a little over 1,000 across the country. They played a pivotal role throughout deploying capital for the PPP. They are embedded in local communities. They average, for one CDFI, they averaged about 30 touch points per loan. And they provide some much needed educational resources in addition to financial products, right? So big banks, by virtue of the regulations of the Community Reinvestment Act, often will push some of this work to local and community banks. And so these banks are there, they're growing, they're willing, they want to engage with communities. The CDFI fund is something that's conducted at the federal level. We're seeing some movement at the state level. So New York State, for instance, wants to create a fund similar to the one at the federal level. Because oftentimes these CDFIs have to match capital that they receive from the fund. And so there's important work of fundraising that has to happen for these organizations as well. And so that's on the financing side. On the community organization side, I think to the extent that we can continue to share the very real impact that chambers of commerce, other business organizations, nonprofits had throughout the pandemic, people are getting interested. The SBA, they're piloting a program, the Community Navigator program, and I'm happy to share the link here in the chat box. But this is essentially realizing that this work is done through a network of organizations, right? And so that through that program, there's a central hub of an organization that applies for funding. And then from that, they collaborate with kind of more regional and localized organizations. And so together it's building this infrastructure of ties that I think is really key for the dissemination of resources quickly and information. So seeing some change, I think that there's, of course, a ton more work that can be done, both on the public and private front. You know, I think given the not just the effect of the pandemic, but the effects of social and civil unrest that we experienced in the past year and a half, there are corporations that are wanting to do some work with businesses on the supplier diversity and procurement front. And so there's excitement. We just want to make sure that that's followed up with action as well.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else on the panel want to weigh in on that? Rocio, Tara. Rocio.
Well, I will be more like a comment. I have been trying to work with several different small businesses, but it's a culture that, you know, even though we bring all this information, how do we make them come and receive the information? How do we make them come and sit in a classroom or in a Zoom meeting? This is beneficial. This information is going to benefit you. We're trying to help you. So how many, I've been sitting in different classes, and probably my colleagues will say the same. There's very few people that are actually, we can put all the programs out there, but they're really, they taking the time to leave their business and take this time to go and invest it in their educations to get these grants, to get these loans. And I think that's part of my challenge. Or I mean, I don't know if you're all facing the same thing, but the challenges are like how you make them come. So the only way that I find is like, I go to you. You don't have to come to me. I have to go and find you. And I'm gonna bring you this piece of paper, because if I tell you to go and visit my website, the chances are that you're not going to click in there. But what I'm using, like Tara says, I'm using social media. I create this program, Creando Éxitos, when I launch it on Facebook, Twitter, because that's the right now, that's what's trending with the community, that they able to get their news there, correct? So it's more like what I have to do is just go there, find, look for this persons that are looking for that information, but they're not trying to leave work. They're not trying to leave their restaurant or their agency or whatever. It just, they want the information, but they don't really want to risk the time they have to invest in their business. So that's one of the approach that I'm trying to get, even, you know, with the limitations we have, we still have to do, you know, minimize our visits and things like that. But I find that that's the only way to really connect with the people so they can get the information.
I thank you. I saw Tara Palacios nodding at several points at the issues that you raised. And it has to do with trust, right? I don't know if Tara, you want to, yeah.
Oh, sure. I can add on. One of the things that, you know, with our Biz Launch en Español program and having Lourdes Morales, who oversees that program, is really like building that bond and constantly seeing you, not going away, going to where you are. I even tell people now, don't ghost us. Like, we're not your boyfriend, girlfriend, or significant other, right? You can ghost them, but don't ghost us. Because, you know, if you go through this program and we've got these resources and tools, they can really help. And I think what's also very helpful is that even though we're like in a city DMV area, it's also very small. And so if you can get referrals from people that have gone through the program that can make recommendations, whether to go to CROCO or GWHCC, I think that building that kind of ecosystem of trust and knowing that you're going to get the help is paramount, especially as we move forward.
Thank you. And I just want to, you use the term ecosystem, and I think I maybe used it toward the beginning of the session, and several people have raised it. That's something in the report that we tried to emphasize in the last section of the report, that we really need to think about the business environment as one, particularly with regard to small firms and minority-owned firms, is that we need to think about the ecosystem. And Marlene underlines the importance of the navigator system that the SBA has been setting up. And that's the sort of thing that we really hope gets emphasis in the period moving forward, because our sense is that it really speaks to the particular needs of vulnerable businesses that are, of course, so important, not only to business owners and their communities, but as Marlene says, to the economy as a whole. I want to ask something, and I think Sol Espinosa might have some helpful observations on this. And Marlene also, who's been doing national level work. We talked quite a bit about how useful findings from a DC Metro study would be toward thinking about the broader national context, and the degree to which the distinctiveness of this metropolitan area might make some of the experiences perhaps less applicable elsewhere. And I don't know just what thoughts you all may have had. I mean, Marlene referred to the utility of having local and metropolitan area studies that exist alongside some of the national samples. But you've both done work that is both national and subnational. Any thoughts about lessons or things that we should think about as we organize initiatives at the DC metro area?
Well, I think that it's very important to understand at a historical level and a national level that when we think about equity, Latinos and traditional settlement areas and groups such as Mexican Americans have had disparities, and that in many ways it's that lack of investment that the pandemic revealed all of these inequalities. And so I think there's definitely an important visibility and transparency and kind of sunshine that occurs. And I think that's something that's very critical for us to understand, that in many of these newer settlement areas, in many places where there's newer immigrants from Central America, that these communities need to leapfrog. We have to learn from places in California, and that is why the work that Marlene does and Slay and the outreach to bring lessons learned at a national scale is so important, because these communities are so fragile, they're so vulnerable. In the area that I've worked in, the northern gateway of Prince George's County, we had the Purple Line transportation project, which had already caused disruption. And so it's, shock, after threat, that these businesses and many of these working families are really very vulnerable. And so there's the opportunity to generalize. I also think that this work is so important because you can benchmark. So if there were successes in Montgomery County, or if in Arlington, there are a level of investment which retain businesses and jobs, you can share that information so that other jurisdictions can benchmark, and you can kind of have this competition, to be more successful. Because in many of these areas and throughout the nation in the Midwest, these are communities that have no infrastructure, and they do not have relationships, and they do not have the institutions. In order for the pandemic recovery to occur at a national level, all of these communities need to kind of leapfrog. And so understanding how this kind of shocked had different economic outcomes in Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and Northern Virginia, in cities, in unincorporated areas, is going to shed light on what infrastructure, what resources, what relationships are necessary. And it's so critical. So I applaud the work that you're doing. It's so critical. It is foundational. I think we need to continue to observe outcomes, but there's a lot of lessons learned locally, but also some lessons to be learned nationally that are very important to keep shedding light on. So thank you for your work.
Thank you, Sol. Thank you. So I think what we might do is bring this to a close. I really am grateful to all of you for taking the time to join us today. I'm grateful to a number of you for all of the time that you invested in helping us to understand this very complex topic as we were carrying out the study. Please remain in touch with us. Anything that we can do to help to advance your work, which is just really so valuable. We certainly are also happy to circulate studies that you generate, whether it's Sol's project with Unidos US or Marlene, we'd be very interested in making sure that we're receiving the stuff that you do from Stanford so that we can use our platforms to try to call attention to it. Because I think that the kinds of efforts that people on these panels are doing are just vitally important for Latino businesses, for Latino communities, and for the broader American economy. So again, with thanks, I trust that next year we will convene the annual Latino Public Affairs Forum on our campus. We have not yet decided what the theme will be, but I think there are many pressing issues that would merit our attention, and I hope that it works out in such a way that we can welcome you all in person on campus once again. So thank you very much. I want to also reiterate thanks to Jim Diniger and his colleagues at COGOD, to Nicole and her colleagues at the Chamber, and I should say to our staff here in the center who supported both the research for this study. We had a team of students who helped us with the data collection and analysis, and also the administrative staff that helped us to get this on the Zoom platform and to make it work without any glitches. So thank you all, and I look forward to staying in touch. Bye-bye.